let's begin with Dr. Goitom. Mary is an associate professor at the School of Social Work at York University. Her work on Ethiopian communities from the diaspora looks at how second-generation youth engage with cross-border connections and community ties, ancestral knowledge systems, and imagined futures as part of their settlement and citizenship experiences. Mary's community-based research explores migration, mobilities, diasporic connections, transnational processes, and social relations grounded in Ethiopian epistemologies and larger African traditional knowledge systems. And Mary, I'm going to stop now and turn it over to you.
Good morning, good evening from wherever you are joining us today. As indicated, my name is Mary Goitom, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Social Work. And my presentation this afternoon is titled Changing Forms of Transnationalism, Rethinking Transnationalism Through the Second Generation. First, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the Social Science and Humanities Research Council Insight Development Grant for making this research possible, in addition to Salam Abebe, who's the project coordinator, and Dr. Nasisi Salomon, who was the research associate, who I still very much work with today with both of them, and it is their also work, not just mine. So a huge thank you to the both of them. So today when you hear me speak and I say we, this is the collective I'm referring to. So in terms of an agenda of what we will be covering today, I will speak to the reasons for migration for the first generation, specifically Ethiopians and Eritreans. And then I will also speak to what that community sort of looks like in terms of numbers and settlement here in the Canadian contexts. I will make the case for why this research is important, briefly discuss methodology, and from there I will also present on the analytic framework for this work, which is transnationalism. And in the findings, this is where I will speak about why they do transnationalism, so how they do it, and then what it looks like. And from there, we will go into discussion, and then, as Kath indicated, short Q&A. So the first generation, what are the reasons for flight? There are three interconnected reasons as to why first-generation Ethiopian and Eritreans left their homeland. First is the 1974 revolution that took place in the country, wherein the emperor at the time, Haile Selassie, was deposed by a Marxist government known as the Derg. His name was Mengistu Haile Mariam, and he established a one-party communist state. And that particular transition was quite violent. While that took place, or as it was taking place, it also, as you can imagine, created political turmoil in the region. There was a civil war between Ethiopia and Eritrea that lasted many, many years, in addition to a border conflict with Somalia, and then within the country, a terror known as the Red Terror, wherein there was a torture and murder of civilians by the state. So as that was also happening, there was also social calamities that were taking place in the region, principally environmental degradation and famine, economic stagnation, and poverty. So this, in essence, is the trifecta that has led to the mass exodus of people from that particular region. So, prior to 1974, migration of Ethiopians and Eritreans was quite rare. Erstwhile to 1976, if you looked at the 1996 Canadian census, it was reported that only 65 Ethiopians had arrived in Canada, and they tended to mostly be those sent by the emperor at the time for the purposes of education, accreditation, and so on and so forth, and then with the expectation that they will return back and bring back some of that learning for the development of the country, which was tended to be the case for the most part. But then what you saw was between 1974 and 1996, the numbers of those leaving increased to about 21,591. And the current population, Ethiopian population, is estimated to be about 70,000 or so. So there's a heavy concentration in Canada's urban centers. So in Toronto, Ottawa, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg is mostly where you would see them. For Eritreans, on the other end, the numbers in the beginning were quite difficult to distinguish, principally because Eritrea was officially part of Ethiopia from 1953 to 1993, therefore complicating categories. So there were no official separate categories for those that identified other than Ethiopian at that time. they were mostly included then in the Ethiopian or other African nation category. In 1996, the Canadian census approximately indicated that there would be about 6,225 as having identified as Eritrean, and then current numbers place the population at approximately 31,385. So why the interest in the second generation? So 40 years of after migration and settlement, there tends to be, in my view, a gap in understanding of how youth are integrated into Canadian society specifically. What does it mean to be Black African in the Canadian context? Based on what I had just presented on, I think you get the idea that migration is a fairly new concept or phenomenon for Ethiopians and Eritreans. And at the same time, they are also quite under-researched in comparison to other groups and communities. And I felt that it was quite interesting and necessary that we engage them in these conversations just to sort of see where they land in terms of their own development, in terms of how they understand their own identity and how they do settlement wherever they may be, and in this case, in the Canadian context. So the study provides, in essence, an in-depth insight into the community settlement processes as opposed to the first generation's perspective through the examination of the children's experiences. So it asks two very fundamental interrelated questions. One, how are they faring? And two, what are some of the areas of challenge and opportunity that they're experiencing? And within that, how is that being mitigated by them? And all of this is being done within the, of course, Canadian backdrop, where there is a multicultural and multilingual understanding of Canadian identities, which is strongly founded and rooted in French and English colonial history, which, as we all know, is still prevalent today. So continuing on with this conversation on why should we be interested, let's look at the numbers. There are almost 1 million African Canadians representing 3% of the country's population. There's a little over 500,000 African Canadians in Ontario, where they represent 4% of the provincial population. The African Canadian population has grown by 65% between 1996 and 2011, so that's 19% increase. And if we look at Statistics Canada even deeper, it estimates that the African Canadian population will double by 2030. So for this reason, we aim to explore the experiences of second generation Africans of Ethiopian and Eritrean descent. So in terms of the methodology for this research, it was qualitative in nature. And it was a constructivist grounded theory methodology, a bit of a mouthful. And we had a sample of 40 Ethiopian and Eritrean young people. Our sampling strategies involved social media heavily, so TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, those were the places. We did one-on-one interviews via Zoom, and they were audio recorded, and then we did, following to that, 2 focus groups with approximately 15 participants in each. We did opportunistic sampling, and the interviews were approximately 90 minutes. One, believe it or not, lasted almost 5 hours. And we did snowball sampling, and so therefore transcribed verbatim and did analysis at the same time as per the constructivist grounded theory specifications. The fact that we used Zoom allowed us to increase accessibility of the study. And so participants represented about 4 provinces, Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and British Columbia. And the average age of participants was 27 years of age. So to the analytic framing, why transnationalism and what do we know about it? It shouldn't be much of a surprise to anyone that the presence and participation of the first generation in the social, cultural, and political economic activities of their home countries is high. Although there is much skepticism about transnationalism in that sense. Why? Because it has become increasingly an empty catch-all concept wherein everything that immigrants are doing now being viewed as transnationalism. So because of that, in the literature and within scholars, there's questions and debates about what actually is the concept of transnationalism and how clearly can we define and measure it as an object of research. So there is a need now to establish the phenomenon in question actually exists, to draw boundaries around its scope, so as to distinguish it from other related phenomena, and then to describe its principal types. So identify the necessary conditions for it to emerge and its growth processes. One of the most interesting things for me in terms of my own research, in terms of my own findings, and I've been doing research with this particular population group for several years now is the survival and durability of transnationalism within the actual second generation. And so I continue to really sort of do research in this area to get deeper and deeper and deeper into the understanding of how they're doing it, why they're doing it, and why it actually survives and is strong in its durability as well. So if we look at also Rumbaut's, who's a very well-known researcher in this area, longitudinal survey study that he did in 2002, and it's also one of the most influential publications when it comes to second-generation transnationality. It says about only 10% of them are transnationally active. However, a decade later, 2012, another study was done by another group, and a quantitative study, and they found that about 11% of the second generation are actually engaged transnationally. So if we are to then accept that perhaps 1 in 10 are transnationally active, and say for the sake of argument that there are perhaps 20 million members of second generation within the Canadian context, then that approximately says to us that 2 million of them are regularly engaged in some form of transnational activity. So by any measure for me, the transnational activities of 2 million people merit some form of an attention. So within that, however, I think what's really, really important to do is to be able to understand that the second generation should actually not be expected to mirror and duplicate their parents' transnational activities in order for them to also be considered transnational, in their engagement. So then the question becomes that we sort of explored, what motivates them to be part of transnational social fields? What kind of activities are actually these young people engaging in? Do they travel to their ancestral land, join in their ancestral land politics, donate to charitable causes? Do they send remittances like their parents do? In what ways are their activities similar or different from that of their parents? And then how do these experiences pretty much affect the connection that they have with their ancestral land over time? So in other words, how does a second generation invent, reinvent, shape, reshape, transform, inform transnational practices? And what does it have to do with their economic and sociocultural integration within the country that they find themselves in that time? And how relative is that or not to how they engage in transnationalism? So in terms of our findings, there's 2 parts. One is a question around what is the motivation for them to want to engage in this way. One of the most important findings that you will see is that transnational identity is actually a result of socialization, especially at the family level, and further supported at the community level. So I have peppered in quotes from participants throughout my slides, so you can sort of see in their own words how they're describing themselves and their activities and the ways in which they have been personally motivated in their engagement. And in their narratives, most of the participants discussed growing up with a strong sense of having an Ethiopian identity in their family, and that they are not only deeply involved in transnational activities, but they also frequently discussed returning home. And similarly to other researchers, my own research, current and previous, also indicated that growing up transnationally involved also learning to speak the heritage language, adhering to the values of respecting one's elders, commitment to education, community-centeredness, being sent to perhaps ancestral land to have cultural connections, and so on and so forth. So for most of them, trips home or to the ancestral home sealed very strong emotional and cultural connections to Ethiopia. And then there's this other concept that has really pretty much enshrined how they do this work, and that in the literature is known as reactive transnationalism. So what is reactive transnationalism? Reactive transnationalism is a response by the second generation to perhaps being taunted or even bullied by host country citizens over the international standing or negative public image of the home country they identify and associate with. So it could be like negative stigmas attached to their ancestral country, such as civil war, infectious diseases such as HIV, AIDS, Ebola, and so on and so forth. And also political unrests and coups. All of that can dampen and negatively affect the second generation's connection to their ancestral land. And if you know anything about the region, in particular Ethiopia, these issues that I just listed are longstanding issues that the country continues to battle with, and also that which the people continue to battle with, both internally and external to themselves. So negative images then of not just Ethiopia for them, but then Africa on the whole in the media tends to undermine the parents' effort to cultivate transnational involvement among their children. Therefore, social stigma and negative representations of one's home country can either invoke different reactions from the first generation and then also that from the second generation. The first generation, they tend to really just strengthen their activities even more, while sometimes in the second generation, it can evoke reactive or anti-transnationalism among them in the sense of perhaps not wanting to engage. But in terms of my own study, my participants were actually quite horrified at the representation of Africa in general and in Ethiopia in particular. And they were very much objected to having to confront these grim and very disheartening narratives about their ancestral homeland as a symbol of hunger and famine. And they saw it as an attempt, interestingly enough, to undermine their self-confidence and connection to the continent as a whole. And so they were quite resentful of that. And in them, it had the complete opposite impact in the sense that reactive transnational for them was one wherein they threw themselves in even more. And they felt that if our particular ancestral homeland was being misunderstood, then that means I'm being misunderstood. And so they took that quite personally, and they did not avoid their ancestral homeland at all. And then there's also the government and civic organizations in the country that fosters transnational connections, not only among the first generation, but also specifically targeting the second generation. So a lot of countries have done this. Greece is one country that comes to mind. And then Ethiopia recently in 2002, wherein the government adopted a policy where Ethiopian immigrants, including the second generation with foreign citizenship, are treated as nationals if they hold a person of Ethiopian origin identification card, also known as a yellow card. So out of my participants, only 5 of my respondents had a yellow card, with more interested to get it. So this then continues to sort of call them into the engaging within the country and then getting them to identify more and more and more with Ethiopia in a transnational kind of way. And then there's also the in-country and civil nonprofit organizations and the role that they play in getting the second generation interested in engaging with the country even more. So many have realized the potential of second generation and have started to actually actively target them and pull them into the orbit of transnational activities. Several researchers have observed, for instance, that immigrant institutions in the host country are major driving force behind transnational connections and activities. So there seems to be an organized effort by NGOs, for instance, operating in Ethiopia, tap into the expertise and resources of immigrant institutions in home country and therefore making that connection. So the presence of active and robust first generation associations and organizations in the diaspora, such as NGOs that they may have commenced, religious institutions, ethnic spaces, all of that make these kinds of ideas available, ideas of transformation, or elements of popular culture that draw the second generation into transnational social fields themselves. So then what are some of the areas that the second generation engage in transnationalism now that we've discussed what motivates them to want to be part of that? One is how they travel home. So is it something that they do themselves, something that they sponsor out of their own pocket? Two is the ways in which they create a sense of awareness about their ancestral home in the diaspora, so a sense of cultural ambassadorship, if you will. The question around philanthropy versus remittances, which is a hot topic, participation in transnational philanthropic activities through these kinds of NGOs that I just discussed, and then transnational politics. So I think it's really important to really have a conversation around self-initiated or self-sponsored travel. Why? Because some researchers are saying that to call travel transnational, it should occur at least twice, and that the duration of stay must be at least 6 months or more. From my perspective, I think that's a tall order in the sense of saying that it has to be 6 months or more. And the 6 months cutoff seems to be a little bit arbitrary from my perspective, because it is essential to explore and pay attention to how actually a single visit lasting only perhaps 2 weeks might have a profound impact on second generation immigrants. Why? Several years back, from one of my studies, this particular story sticks out for me from a participant. He's a young man, and he was sort of transporting himself back into the past. And I was asking him about his first trip. Born and raised here, in Toronto. And he said he only knew about Ethiopia based on what the stories that his parents had told him. And the family had decided that they were going to travel back home. So they got on the plane and they were going back home. He said that, looking back now, that transnational social fields began for him the moment they got on the plane. And when I specifically asked him why, he said, we got on Ethiopian Airlines. And he said, everyone on that plane looked like me. The pilot looked like me. The stewardesses looked like me. The person sitting next to me, behind me, in front of me, all 300 some odd people on that plane looked like me. He says, this was new for me. I didn't even realize we were capable of such a thing. And then the moment he lands there at the airport, he sees everyone that looks like him. When his parents are conducting business, they're visiting friends, family, and going to places. He said, oh my God, people look like me, actually run things. And that was the first realization that he ever had. And it actually made him think a little bit deeper about how he understood himself in Canada, his identity construction, and what was possible and not possible for him. And then the experiences he had the moment him and his family got on the plane. Right? And that was in his childhood. So if we sort of hold that information in our minds, then we need to sort of start asking about how their journeys to Ethiopia actually help them to appreciate not just the culture, but how the ways in which it makes them attached, develop friends, hone in not only their language skills, but then also the ways in which they plan to engage with the country in the future. So notwithstanding the frequency and the length of stay, traveling to ancestral land as a concrete transnational action actually needs to be explored or unpacked. So if you were to divide this into two types, it would be the following. One, parent-induced or initiated travel. As part of raising children with dual identities and engendering transnational awareness, parents often arrange for them to travel to ancestral homeland indefinitely for most cases. Such parent-initiated, sponsored, sometimes even forced trips are essential and foundational, as I tell you in the story that I just shared with you. In any case, from my participants, they actually saw these trips a little bit as being hasty, and they felt to some extent a little bit cheated because it happened so quickly. And so much was happening in that moment that they wanted more of it. So those early childhood travels often helped them to develop, among other things, a sense of themselves, a maybe different composite of what might be possible for them beyond the confines of where they live. So these self-initiated, then self-sponsored future style travel undertaken later in life shows a little bit more of a commitment and continuity, I think, in transnational connection. So the second generation then has to be considered to be engaging in transnational practices when, without any pressure from parents and community, they fund it themselves. They go there, they visit these places, either through tourism, sightseeing, learning the language, vacation, work, investment, whatever the case may be. And my argument is that if we actually pay attention to how they themselves are purchasing these very costly plane tickets, it is indicative of transnational way of being in and of itself. So it's important to consider the purpose of these travels and the impact that it has on people, instead of placing arbitrary timeframes for how long something has to happen in order for it to exist and be real. And then the other concept of it to consider is this notion of cultural ambassadorship. If you know anything about the culture, the Ethiopian culture, one of the things that you were taught and that you learn is that you are a reflection of your community. So what you do, you reflect your parents, you reflect your ancestors. And on top of that, you reflect everybody else that identifies within that umbrella group of what it means to be Ethiopian. So anything that you do has an impact on everybody else, a sense of very strong collectivism. And we can have an argument about the pros and cons of that till we're blue in the face, but this is essentially how they are raised and how they understand things to be. So for them, cultural ambassadorship is a process of, in this particular context, of struggling against and discrediting the mischaracterizations and misrepresentations of their ancestral homeland and interrupting these stereotypes and prejudices. And they take that as something that is innately theirs to do and important for them to do. So they do this by form of educating others and interrupting this kind of thinking, but then also introducing the culture to friends and other individuals and being very open about who they are, where they come from, the pros and cons of that, but the fact that it does exist and it also has its challenges, but it also has its good parts to it. So here, I think it's important to consider how participation in an ethnified community in and of itself informs not just cultural ambassadorship, but then the ways in which they do transnationalism moving forward. And next to that is philanthropy, not remittances. As I'm sure you all know, remittances is a billion-dollar industry, wherein the first generation tend to send money to their countries of origin, families, so on and so forth. And it is known in the literature as actually being one of the best indicators of transnationalism. But there's also considerable anxiety among scholars and remittance receiving countries as to what would happen to these immigrant sending nations should the second generation discontinue sending remittances, for example. So remittances then are essentially the lifeblood of struggling homeland economies. So for the most then persistent question, and for anyone that does research within the second generation, is how are they? How is their behavior when it comes to sending money to their ancestral land? Is that something they're going to do? Is it something that they're doing? Where do they stand on that particular question, right? For most of my participants, they gravitated towards philanthropic activities more so than remittances, because as you can see through the narrative here that I've shared from Dawit, they talked extensively about the burden and the responsibility that they saw their parents going through, and they don't want to inherit that level of actual engagement. They don't actually see it as being fruitful at all. Instead, they report sending money or engaging with nonprofit organizations here in Canada or in Ethiopia that provide support for the country there, or engaging in fundraising activities that support the well-being of others, including family members. And when it comes to transnational politics, this generation very much admire their parents' keen interest in their homeland politics, and very much also admire and respect the political engagement in the host country on the issues of concerns to Ethiopia. Importantly, they also acknowledge the ways in which their parents fostered in them this desire to be engaged civically, right, within Canada and in itself as well. So this kind of encouragement has resulted in a sustained interest and participation in politics among this particular generation. Because of this focus, they also have excellent understanding, for the most part, about the political developments and events that unfold in the country. And just as importantly, they agree with their parents' fundamental values when it comes to Ethiopian transnational politics, that the democratization of Ethiopia remains central. However, they are fundamentally in a disagreement with their parents about the ways in which politics is being handled. In fact, an overwhelming number of them, if not all, indicated that they avoided direct participation in Ethiopian diaspora politics. And you could see on your screen why they feel the way that they feel. And they actually saw and criticized the ways in which the first generation rallied and organizes politically. They saw that the protests and the rallies as being a dominant staple for how diaspora politics happens. And they've usually found these things to be spontaneously arranged, poorly orchestrated, and with no particular concrete agenda for what's going to happen next. So unlike their US counterparts, second generation, who are very much actively engaged in creating an Ethiopian voting bloc, because the numbers in the States are much higher than the numbers here in Canada, here they're not so much interested in creating some kind of a Ethiopian voting bloc within the Canadian system, but they're very much interested in more of a philanthropic, peaceful approach to development that isn't always in-your-face politics, the ways in which their parents have been engaging in it. So that's quite a departure, I would say. So in terms of discussion and what this all means, here in the cultural nationalist attitudes pretty much support a one-dimensional or a narrow construction of Canadian identity. So living most of one's life in Canada, having Canadian citizenship, being a Christian, are very much important to what constitutes quote unquote Canadian identity. The challenge, however, is that Canada's large urban centers, where immigrants tend to be, account for about 50% of the population. And we're not even taking into account those with refugee status. Toronto, for instance, has 51.2% of the population being born outside of Canada. And these kinds of socioeconomic trends very much create a boundary or demarcation between Canadians and the ethnic Canadian. And so the term ethnic is not applied, in essence, to the two dominant cultures, French and English, despite growing recognition of their settler positionality in Canada. thus creating what is known as a hierarchy of social and cultural privilege that my participants talked extensively about, despite being born and raised here. So these kinds of quote unquote old world ideologies continue to advance a sense of racial, ethnic, and linguistic trend that directly subverts multiculturalism. So there's a range of sociocultural media that we have that continue to perpetuate a sort of static construction of Canadian identity across time and space. And the nation's colonial past and systemic exclusion of Indigenous populations pretty much points to the sort of continued domination of, say, British and French traditions, one that is preserved and favored within Canada. And my participants were very, very, very angry about what's happening, what has happened to Indigenous populations in Canada, and stood in total solidarity with them, and informs greatly about how they feel about their Canadianness in and of itself. And so these trends then have prevented the expansion of traditional construction of Canadian identity by rendering immigrants and, say, non-Anglophone and non-Francophone Canadians within the marginal space of this hyphenated hybrid identities that faces issues around legitimacy and recognition. But for them, the interesting thing is that they were actually raised in communities where transnationalism and multiculturalism were actually lived realities. So it's not so much that they just grew up within Ethiopian communities per se, but that larger immigrant community from which where their parents settled, for instance. And so they were quite exposed to different kinds of cultures and individuals and groups that came to Canada for similar reasons. And so for them, transnationalism and multiculturalism are not theories and abstract ideas, they're actual lived experiences and lived realities. So it's not a policy. It's not something that you can legislate onto them. They know it because they embody it and they live it. They talked extensively about the sense of collectivism that they experienced with neighbors, for instance, that were not part of their own immediate culture. The sense of reciprocity, wherein one is always guaranteed a plate of food at somebody's home in that kind of sense. And they talked about themselves as actually being representative, if not having a sense of a true mosaic and what that actually means and how that actually helped them develop or are in the process of also developing what is known as cultural proficiency. So wherein the literature and the media and everything else sort of pits groups in different communities together, for them, they didn't necessarily see each other as threats, but rather as a representation of a transnational mosaic. So there was an openness to free exchange, to learn from each other, find commonalities, while also celebrating their differences. So pushing them and encouraging to learn more about each other also allowed them, in a sense, to learn more about their ancestral home. So when it comes to actually asking them, so how do you identify? Are you Canadian? Like, where do you sit? And this is an enduring question that I ask in all of my research. And it's always interesting to me, even now, that the answer hasn't changed. They're Ethiopian or Eritrean, for instance, first, despite being born and raised here. And they identify as Canadian in a legal sense. So for them, in terms of, if you were to sort of distill it down to the Canadian side of them, they talk about it more in terms of the city that they live in. So for them, it's, if it's Toronto or if it's Manitoba, like there's more of a niched sense of a claiming of a city in that way, as opposed to a country, interestingly enough, or even a province or their locale. And when you ask them about integration in that sense, they will say, well, in what way? Like if we're talking about economically, then I guess we are, I don't know. But we tend to, in the literature, talk a lot about integration as an end point, right? Even in practice. I think it's important to know that it's a process whereby people are engaged actively in defining it for themselves over time. So if you're looking at integration from a policy perspective, then it can be argued that they're integrated, because a number of the youth from my study were working in industries that directly contended with policy change at a national level. And parents ensured that they were multilingual. So they either spoke French or English, both. They spoke other languages, and they were very actively involved in that kind of career. So the results from the study then reinforce the fact that, and if we're looking at the idea of integration within Canada, I think we're sort of missing the point here with this particular group. They, in my view, are more globally integrated than locally so. right? So what I'm trying to say is that these young people are actually internationalists to the core. And they adhere to sort of these ideas or frameworks around Afrofuturism, which is Black people within the diaspora, a method of self-liberation and self-healing. It's a form of reframing, and it's grounded in historical, spiritual, and conceptual ideas. It also presents as a platform to thrive and achieve without external influences as much as possible, whether that medium is music, art, policy, philanthropy, so on and so forth. So here what we're looking at is the nexus of identity and this concept of futurity, which is what I study, which is an imagined world building. And that's what they are engaged in when they're engaging in these kinds of transnational activities. So if you wanted to learn more, for instance, about this work and where they stand and what they think, one of the deliverables, the community deliverables of the study, was us putting together a podcast called Kumnagar Talks. Kumnagar, loosely defined in English, essentially means having to discuss or discussing something of value and of importance. Here we engaged in about 11 episodes where we discuss a lot of these questions that I'm posing today in their life and within the diaspora, and you can find it for free on Spotify for you to engage with. So I think I will stop here if anybody has any questions, comments, or anything of that matter.
Perfect. We just shared the link to the podcast in the chat box.
Oh,
Mary.
Kath, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me?
I can't hear you. Perhaps it's me.
Can anyone,
Sorry.
Miss Katie, I can hear you.
Oh, there you are. Apologies.
Okay, sorry. It might have been a glitch in coming off mute, but that's okay. I'm glad you can hear me. I was just saying, Mary, that we've shared a link to the podcast in the chat box. So we encourage folks to check that out. We've also shared the 2 episodes that were focused specifically on youth conversations on YouthREX's Knowledge Hub. So that's another place you can go to learn more and hear more from this work. And thank you so much, Mary, for sharing with us. We do have a little bit of time if anyone has any burning questions for Mary about the work, or any questions to clarify anything you've heard. I'll give folks a moment if you want to think about what that might be, or share in the chat box. The other option, of course, is that we forge ahead and we hear from Ahmed, and then we can carve out time towards the end of the webinar for a more fulsome discussion. So I haven't seen any questions pop up. Not seen anyone indicating that they have a question. Oh, that's great. Somebody just shared in the chat box how informative the presentation was, Mary, and that it is their exact experience as a first-generation Eritrean Canadian, and that you verbalized their experience so eloquently. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Wonderful. Okay, well, why don't we move on to Ahmed's presentation, and then we'll bring you back, Mary, for more discussion, and we'll have space for more questions from folks. Ahmed, welcome. Ahmed Ilmi is an assistant professor in the Department of Global Development Studies at the University of Toronto Scarborough. His research explores how Black African Muslim youth in Toronto construct a unique cultural identity that merges their Islamic values with their Somali heritage, centering on the term "Say Wallahi," swear to God. His findings illuminate how youth navigate both Islamophobia and anti-Black racism in their schools and communities, and the importance of rethinking how the educational system can center the identity of Black Muslim youth in the classroom and in urban education research. Ahmed's research spans race and ethnicity, African studies, critical development studies, diaspora and transnationalism, and the ethics of community research. In recognition of his community-engaged scholarship, he received the 2024 African Scholars Community Development Award. Welcome, Ahmed. I'm going to turn it over to you now, and we'll pull up your slides.
Thank you, Kathy. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the YouthREX organizing team, Kathy, Uzo, Aneche, Rahima, the whole team. Thank you so much. I know it takes a lot of work to put together a program and organize. Thank you for also inviting myself and Professor Mary to create a communal space to have conversations about youth. I'd like to also thank the youth educators, parents, youth workers, community partners, researchers, scholars. It's both an honor and a privilege to share this space and to be invited to YouthREX. I've sent over my slides because I'm having technical difficulties. So I believe it's somebody will be circulating the slides and I will be indicating next and so forth. Yeah, so the title of my presentation this afternoon is Say Wallahi, Diaspora Youth, Islamophobia and Anti-Black Racism, Implications for Education. This research was actually published in the Journal of Urban Education this August of 2025. And it is research conducted with community youth in community settings, not in schools. And that was deliberately done to sort of get underneath experiences of anti-Black racism and Islamophobia and create a safe school, safe environment where the youth can share their lived experiences and so forth. So for the purposes of this presentation, I will first tell you about who I am as a community-based researcher, give you some working definitions of Islamophobia and anti-Black racism. I know many of you are familiar with the scholarship and the works and have been doing the works on the ground, but it's also good to sort of put some work in terms of these are the working definitions that I'm working with. And that will enable us, or me in particular, to think about intersectional identities. What does it mean to be Canadian? What does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be Muslim of Somali ancestry? I will then begin to ask the research questions and get into the nuts and bolts of the research. So who am I as a researcher? I started this work trying to figure out my own identity location within the Canadian landscape as a first generation myself, someone who as a child experienced exile, social and cultural dislocation. So when I started to do this work, I was in search of my own way, trying to find my own way back home, in search for identity, culture, social and political belonging. This was an internal search/struggle. And this is part of a conversation that many members of diaspora has experienced, diaspora communities experiencing in general. And it is centered around notions of where is home, what does home look like, how do we imagine it? And in what ways do we think about home? This is largely a political question in terms of identity and figuring out and asserting one's space in the world and figuring out who they ultimately are. This ultimately connected me to a wider global conversation about civil conflict, political instability, and what it means to ultimately be Somali, in quotes, of African ancestry, together with processes that some have called the becoming Black. And I'm thinking through Ibrahim Awada's work, 1998, 2003, amongst others. And this is a deeply complex racial identity that is constantly sort of in the making. I began to arrive at thinking about identity, connecting research with the Somali diaspora and studying questions of race, racialization, social exclusion and exile and displacement. And what I came across was a unique diaspora cultural identity that the young people were not only negotiating, but were in the making of. And I say negotiating because one of the things that came out was older community members saw youth and children that didn't speak Somali a certain kind of way. So there was an element of, I'm going to claim this identity, I'm going to be Somali, and I'm going to be Somali in my own way. And I will call this the becoming, and I will speak to it throughout the essential presentation. Essentially, this is a making of a new Muslim identity throughout the English-speaking world. In this work, I also bring a particular sort of Canadian experience that is both diasporic and rooted in an African ancestry. As someone who has spent most of his life in Canada, there's a particular diasporic location that I'm speaking to in terms of Toronto slang, in terms of Toronto culture, and being in sort of within the Toronto context. As far as a researcher, I'm an interdisciplinary Black studies scholar working around notions of diaspora, identity, culture, race, trained as a sociologist of education who teaches critical perspectives in youth and development. Next slide. So yeah, that's the community research component and my social justice orientation. So working definitions. According to the Canadian Guide of Understanding and Combating Islamophobia for a More Inclusive Canada 2021, Islamophobia is defined as a system as systemic hostility, prejudice, fear, and hatred directed towards Muslims or people perceived as Muslim, manifesting as discrimination, exclusion, and violence at individual, institutional, and systemic levels, often rooted in racism and stereotypes that frame Islam as a threat to greater society, greater civilizations, and ultimately to the West. That is my first working definition of Islamophobia. Next slide. The next definition that I think is essential to this presentation is anti-Black racism. According to the University of Toronto Task Force on Anti-Black Racism 2021, I was actually a member of this task force. Anti-Black racism is embedded in Canadian institutions, embedded in Canadian institutions, thoughts, policies, practices that reflect and reinforce negative beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination directed towards, people of African descent and their unique histories and experiences of enslavement and colonization here in Canada. Next slide. So these working definitions sort of enable us to settle the ground in terms of what we're talking about and what it means. And this will allow me to sort of dive into this intersectional identity, looking at multiple locations of opportunities, struggles, and experiencing social exclusion and discrimination. As far as the context of the study highlights the ways in which Muslim Black African youth situated in Toronto, Canada, have constructed a unique cultural identity that merges their Islamic values with their Somali heritage, centering around the term say wallahi. Say wallahi loosely meaning swear to God. Over a period of 24 months, 32 in-depth, semi-structured interviews were conducted with self-identifying Muslim youth aged 18 to 20 years old. Analysis was systematically organized from the interviews, highlighting the ways in which these youth experience both Islamophobia and anti-Black racism. The term say wallahi, as stated earlier, is a fusion of English and Somali, which loosely translates to swear to God, and is a part of a complex communicative systems of codes in which the youth have operationalized to interpret and navigate their world. Now, what is unique about this particular group is there are many Somali diasporas around the world, but this particular young group, born in Toronto, raised in born in Ontario, raised in Toronto, have constructed this identity around say wallahi, and it's universally essentially spoken today. The fusion of the word, this meme now that is present in all social media platforms, is not only a cultural youthful phenomena that is now taken up by both Somali Canadians, other Muslim Canadians, and Canadians exposed to this unique diasporic culture. But this is a loaded language. This loaded language speaks volumes to cultural expression. As such, this code of communication is spoken throughout the English-speaking world. And in many ways back home as well, within local identity politics and context in terms of who understands who was born in Somalia, who wasn't, and so forth. And more importantly, in large urban cities like Toronto, you'll see someone who's non-Somali will say wallahi, right? They don't have to be Muslim, they don't have to be Somali, but you'll hear their expression. As far as the study, it was conducted through qualitative study of Canadian youth of Somali descent living in Rexdale. That's the community that I focused on. Revealed complexities and strengths of diaspora identities situated at the cultural intersection of Blackness and religion, vis-a-vis being Muslim. Next slide. The key research questions. This qualitative research question was guided by the following questions. One, how do Muslim Black youth take up their racial, religious, and diasporic identities? Two, how does Islamophobia and anti-Black racism impact the youth? Three, how do Black Muslim youth resist multiple oppressions in their education? Four, what roles do educators, administrators, and policymakers play in creating spaces for students to be able to holistically embody their identities in their community schools? Five, what possibilities do identity markers offer in connecting identity to schooling, knowledge production, and larger societal questions? So essentially, what does it mean to be Muslim, Black in our society? How do these youth sort of function? How do they assert their identities and so forth? I also ask these questions because the Muslim Black body is rendered invisible and socially positioned as Black, non-Arab, non-South Asian, as a category outside of the universality of Islam because of the ways in which race is organized globally, with whiteness at the top of the apex and everybody else at the bottom, while Islam is casted out. To put it in Razak's words, 2007, uncivilized danger to the West. Therefore, in thinking about Black Muslim youth and or Muslim youth who are Black, there is a categorization of danger to society attached to the perceived criminality of Blackness, particularly male, and dangers of Islam. But what I'm interested in from respect to these youth is how these youth define their own identities, how they navigate the world, and more importantly, how they produce identity and culture, a diasporic cultural identity. How they take up Islam and Blackness as an intersecting identity, and what unique actions, expressions, and ways of being they exhibit as young people, right? So essentially, they're not sort of sitting passively experiencing racism, anti-Black racism, or Islamophobia. No, they're creating culture. They're living. They're resisting constantly, and they're defining themselves. So thinking about the simplest things, like turning away from the television television screen when you see something that's haram. Haram meaning something that's not permissible in Islam, right? What's appropriate, what's not, things like dating, music, vis-a-vis hip hop and or other genres, following Islamic tradition, and so forth. It is about the ways in which these youth embody religion, spirituality, and their beliefs, and how they ultimately exhibit them. Essentially, what it means to be Black and Muslim in society in the West today. And the idea here is that youth mix and match their own sort of culture, take up their Blackness, with hair, with attire, with what they wear, with what they don't wear, and how they express themselves. And that is very, very unique. Next slide. I'll talk a little bit about sort of the research methods. I know I've mentioned it a bit earlier, but it's, again, qualitative research methods focusing on the lived experiences of Black Muslim youth, semi-structured interviews, 32 in total, 45 minutes each, conducted with Black Muslim youth of Somali descent, ages 18 to 22 in the Rexdale community. Field notes were taken, video recordings were taken and done. Participants all sort of got pseudonyms, and they had informed consent. As far as myself as a researcher, I had inside status as someone who shares a racial, cultural identity and so forth. And that sort of allowed me access, someone who was also familiar with the community, that has ties in the community, but I was also partly outside as someone who was affiliated with an academy, and essentially my age, because I'm no longer a young person. The themes were coded analytically, interview notes were taken, and Vivo software was used to construct the themes of the patterns. As far as research is also concerned, the research was not just about research in general, but it was more about researching Blackness and thinking through Blackness through a Black studies research lens. Black studies as a critical community-based research, methodologically and as an approach, allows one to study the Black subjecthood because it doesn't work with the traditional colonial dispositioning, the logics of Black life and how it's situated, particularly the Black lived experiences, to draw on McKittrick 2020. Methodologically, it also allows for the discursive shifting of anti-Black racism and the racial violence in terms of specificities and complexities. It also acknowledges the ways in which embodied Black communal knowledges are subjectively located outside of the traditional scientific knowledge. It also highlights the historical colonial racializing relationships in which research in the Black communities have been synchronized. More importantly, as far as Black community knowledge are concerned, the question of engagement and thinking about what constitutes knowledge from a Black embodiment perspective as an epistemic, cultural, rooted site, the body is able to produce knowledge about the world, about themselves, and about their own location in relations to race and Blackness. As far as, next slide, as far as Black Muslim youth and their social location, Samah Rahima 2021 explains Muslim youth are constructed as objects of moral and political concern due to their racial, religious, and gender identities. Black youth of all ages, of all genders, are often seen to be at risk of a range of social, academic, and psychological problems, which in turn leads to them being disproportionately policed, trafficked, expelled, incarcerated. Whereas 2016, Noriega 2008, the saliency of the terrorist to the perception that Muslim boys and young men are prone to violence, while Muslim girls and youth and young women, are often pathologized as experiencing religious sanctioned forms of gender oppression. So essentially, this is the dichotomy in which a lot of the youth that I've interviewed and worked with have highlighted. Sahima's assertion highlights the ways in which Black Muslim youth are constantly constructed by the white colonial gaze, a concept that Stuart Hall coined in 1997, called the whiteness in their eyes, where the Black body is categorized in multiple non-human ways located outside of white humanity. Next slide. Now, there were many themes to think through, but there were 5 major themes. Before we get into the themes, or I get into the themes, what I'd like to share is the youth participants' voices and what they had to say as far as the research and their lived experience. Again, these are pseudonyms. Haji, 21-year-old male, explains with Blacks, they can understand the race thing. And with Muslims, you don't have to explain how the world is Islamophobic. I fear for my mother because she's a hijabi and she's always afraid my brothers and I will get arrested for nothing. It's unforgiving either ways, end quote. Haji here highlights both Islamophobia and anti-Black racism and the multiple embodied fears that he carries because of his identity and the ways in which his identity is ultimately taken up. Sarah explains, sometimes I would wait for other Muslim students to walk up to the teachers and excuse themselves to go pray. Then I would just follow along. But when we go to the prayer space, it was just us standing before Allah, God, nothing. No one could take that away from us, especially Fridays, because everyone was serious and came together. But I always noticed the tension walking back to class. Sometimes the teachers would be looking at us, looking at the time, Zara. And this is Zara's sort of take highlights the ways in which prayer space is sometimes needed by Muslim youth to pray, and the ways in which that is ultimately policed and or regulated within the school system. Zara here speaks to notions of community and belonging in prayer space, highlights the importance of spirituality and well-being. Next slide. Aisha here asserts, as soon as I started to wear the hijab, my friends at school started asking me if my family was forcing me to put on the hijab. And although initially seemed supportive, they eventually almost disappeared from my life. Even when I'm in public, I find people will often avoid speaking to me. And when they often do, they often keep it short. It is as if wearing the hijab equates to not speaking English. I am the same person, just wearing a hijab. Things were quite different before I started before I started covering. So I really don't get it when they are times bold enough to ask me where I'm from, Aisha. Right. And this is Aisha's quote here equates sort of wearing the hijab with being oppressed, but also being outside of sort of civilization, outside of Canadianness, because how could she be wearing the hijab if she can speak English, or why would she be doing that? As Aisha here speaks to questions of gender oppression and the Muslim body being rendered alien to Canadian society, quotes Canadian civilization, as well with the idea of oppression against women. Next slide. Selma states, our parents want us to be a certain way. Society thinks we're oppressed, and we are trying to figure out, it out. There's always the feeling of not belonging anywhere. So we have to make our own space. Selma here is speaking to the diasporic youth location as far as a young lady, speaking of these tensions between public life, private life, and who she is as a person, and the constant need to figure out spaces that she and her peers can form communities, be whole, and not be judged, right? And for them to exercise self-determination. Again, with the question of gender, I mean, quotes, I'm a hijabi, how do you think the world sees me, right? Alluding to this notion of oppressed women, hijab, and so forth. Now, also, as I will highlight this as well, when I was sort of doing this research and beginning to publish it, one of the things that sort of came out was, as a male or someone who identified as a male, a lot of the sort of journals said, you got to take out this component about gender. You can't necessarily speak about gender and oppression in women because you're male. I see the sort of tension there. However, as far as tradition and culture is concerned, you don't sort of, how do I put it, decide what community voices you highlight and don't. And the onus was on me to sort of put out the work and also sort of critique the ways in which, yes, there is gender oppression in societies, and how do you mitigate that? How do you sort of transition through that, and how you highlight these voices are also important, right? But again, going back to the earlier quote that I had with Salima Vehan, as far as women are taken up as oppressed and males are taken up as a danger to society. Ali states, everyone's trying to call the cops on us. Even when we're minding our business, they think we're criminal. I can feel the tension when I walk into the store wearing the thobe. The thobe is Islamic tradition. And I found a lot of the youth that I interviewed for this particular research wear it on Fridays, going to school, going on their, about their days on Fridays as a part of their tradition. Right? And they can notice how they're seen when they wear it versus when they don't. So Ali here highlights the categorization of the Muslim body as both criminal and terrorist, particularly when there's tension in society. Next slide. Now, although there were many themes, the most important themes when thinking about Black Muslim youth identities, schooling and societies, and their experiences in schools is experiences of both Islamophobia and anti-Black racism. 2, prayer space offered elements of belonging and community. 3, Black Muslim and female sort of constituted wearing the hijab in public spaces, perception versus not wearing it. for the concept of halal and haram in terms of diasporic youth, culture, identity, what is permissible in Islam, how do you function as a sort of quote, good Muslim, but also living in the West, and what that ultimately means. 5, a lot of these youth identified the fact that they were easy targets during times of crisis. Yet what was incredible, however, is how these youth were incredibly resilient and hopeful. How despite experiencing both Islamophobia and anti-Black racism, the youth were optimistic about their futures and were very sure of who they were and how they wanted to chart their own futures. Essentially, I met a group of brilliant young people, young dreamers. Now, from a sociology of identity perspective, it's quite remarkable that there have been many Muslim and Black diasporas, African diasporas, yet the say wallahi sort of have operationalized and constructed a contemporary youthful culture that speaks to their very existence, their culture, social location, expressions, and so forth. And in many ways, it's a cultural phenomenon originated in Toronto, born in Toronto, right? And I would ultimately qualify this from a contemporary youth perspective as far as Toronto slang. One cannot overlook that the youth navigate their multiple worlds also in their own terms. Again, the notion that they're not sort of standing idle, experiencing racism and not doing anything about it. No, they are empowered and they're incredibly resilient, and they're trying to figure out how to navigate the world and how to ultimately come out on top. Now, as far as their Islamic identity and or religious identity, born shortly after 9/11, home life, parents, culture, and being exposed to images of their homeland, culture, and identity being always taken up as a place of civil and political unrest, essentially as a dark continent with a twist of terrorism, it's damaging to the soul. And ultimately, there's no escaping this location, because this cultural location, because parents, grandparents, and youth identities are all linked to ideas about back home vis-a-vis Somalia, what's happening there, but also in the West as a Black Muslim cultural identity. And, you know, having constantly experiencing your identity being taken up and pathologized is a problem in society. There's also the concept of thinking through the good Muslim, right? What is permissible? What is not permissible? How do you navigate that? How do you spiritually connect when you want to? How do you disconnect when you don't feel like being spiritual, and so forth? What these youth, the say wallah here, thinking through from a social, cultural worldview perspectives gives the youth space to assert their own voices and express their identities. Right? Again, with the good concept of good Muslim navigating Islamic culture and spiritual beliefs, the duality of culture, the dilemmas, what do you do? Is a good Muslim one that just doesn't eat pork? How do you navigate society? How do you interact with non-Muslims? How do you connect the idea about sort of religion, spirituality, and Islam within your private domain with a wider community, but also with a higher being? Right? With the concept of the good Muslim, what is permissible, what is not? The term is halal versus not halal. John O'Brien, 2017, in his works, highlights the ways in which Muslim youth in the West are ultimately living contested identities. And on top of that, to be Black and Canadian in the West, constantly being tied to what is happening, not only abroad, but what is happening within your own home country as well. And then next slide. As far as them being Black Muslim youth, being Black, racially profiled, experiencing policing, racial injustice, life ultimately in their communities, in their hoods, and so forth. Those are all issues to sort of contend with. Now, moving on to the implications for urban education and educators in general. So the question of education is central to the ways in which one's identity is positioned in any given society. As such, the classroom is the first space in which children and youth see their own location in society outside of their home life. The question of this for the Sewalahi is, what does it mean to be Black, African, and Muslim within an urban Canadian context? And ultimately, who are we to judge? How do those identities get regulated, policed, and surveilled within society and in the classroom and in community schools? Education is more than physical classroom space, curriculum, pedagogy, teachers, peers, administrators. Education establishes a student's place in society. Looking at the ways in which the Sewalahi have taken up and claimed their multiple identities as Black and African in their own terms and Muslim offers a nuanced understanding of contemporary youth identities, particularly as it relates to Islamophobia and anti-Black racism in education. This identity location offers new ways of remapping the possibilities of reclaiming, producing, and reproducing identities outside of the confines of colonial knowledges and discourses that racialize and construct the other. For the interviewees, their African, Black, Muslim identities are rooted in, or at least connected to, their ancestral heritage, customs, and cultures that are connected to their communities in the diaspora. Right? They have been able to imaginatively evoke and subvert communication systems and codes to create youthful cultures, cultural capital that enables them not only to understand the world from where they are, but to negotiate and navigate the world as they see fit. For educators and school administrators to grasp the many challenges imposed on their students, they must be willing to question the very assumptions that they hold against the populations they serve. Now, what is also important is that it's not uncommon for schools serving economically underprivileged students or racialized immigrant communities or backgrounds to be branded as sort of trouble schools or ghetto schools, right? Now, there are profound implications in terms of how teachers and administrators see their schooling community and how they engage it as a place of learning. Is it a place of learning, a space to engage students, or is it a space to confine students, discipline them, and so forth, right? And these are the spaces where parents wouldn't take their children, transfer them out. Right? School educators and administrators must also work courageously and be willing to construct, create, and develop co-curriculum with their learners with the aim of centering their identities in ways that are culturally inclusive. And I also make the point in the research paper that education is too important to be left in the hands of administrators and educators and policymakers. Concluding slide. As stated throughout this presentation, this study brings multiple perspectives on how Islamophobia and anti-Black racism impact youth living in Toronto, including discussions on how these youth, referred to as the Sewalahi, embody a diasporic identity that allows them to form tight communities within communities. The centrality of questions of identity lie not only in the recognition that one's identity is inherently multiple, but also in the understanding that the ways in which identities are read, interpreted, and categorized are political in nature. As such, there are profound implications on the colonial gaze on the Black Muslim body. The colonial gaze is spiritually wounding. The question of what it means to be Black, African, and Muslim enriches the conversations about how youth take up their embodied identities and how they also articulate them. Community youth are inherently incredibly creative, resourceful, and are creators on how to navigate their multiple worlds. So they've created that cultural capital for themselves. And ultimately, the question of how to center students' identities is essential if we're truly invested in our youth's well-being and collective futures. Thank you.